And we're back online. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to enjoy some coffee, some tea, some crackers, whatever's your pick. We're back with Amina, and she's going to be giving us a wonderful presentation that sort of stands out from the rest of the presentations because it is focused on the misuse of AI and technology at large. And I'm very excited for her to come in and just give us a primer on her perspective. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the title of the presentation because I had struggles with it yesterday, but I'll let her get on with the show. And yeah, pleasure to have you, Amina.
Yeah, thank you, Joaquin. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Amina Shakeel. For context, I am a student of human rights, so I graduated with a degree in human rights and sociology, which basically just means I studied group behavior and then all the rules we have to protect civil liberties in this world today. I have done some research as an undergraduate on digital authoritarianism, which is the topic of today's presentation. And essentially what that is when the state turns our technology against us. Technology meaning facial recognition, it could mean your own laptop, it could mean your own cell phone, just any way that digital infrastructure is used to harm other people. And so for clarity, I acknowledge that there are good uses of AI, some, like in Australia. I'll talk about more of that later. But yeah, like Joaquin said, I'm talking about the misuse today, so I don't want that to be unclear. Welcome, human rights in the digital world. Okay, so digital authoritarians are essentially just countries that are harnessing technology, I'm going to say, for evil. And what does that mean? There's a certain ability for governments to control what kind of narrative is being shared. And so digital authoritarians typically have a really restrictive governance structure, and they want to limit how people talk about it, how people engage with it, and in order to enact control, control dissent, and just generally make sure that they are in charge of the narrative. So some examples of this, digital authoritarians, at least from a human rights perspective, I included Australia, but I wouldn't say they're authoritarian. They use facial recognition to actually monitor COVID contact tracing, which is technically a good use, but they're one example because they do have a system of cameras. Iran is one. They track their civilians, and depending on how people respond to social norms, they will be punished for it, approached by the police. In China, similarly, people are tracked and their social good is recorded, and they get benefits in exchange for essentially the knowledge that all of their data is being stored by the government. Same with Myanmar. It's used to surveil journalists. Same in India. Oh, I apologize. That's the door. Israel is a huge case of facial recognition surveillance because they're actually a great exporter of this technology. I apologize again, but we'll talk more about that later. Oops. Here's our table of contents. Okay, so digital authoritarianism is, like I said earlier, just the ability to turn the devices we have into weapons without our knowledge and without our consent, certainly. And so this, as a human rights student, is totally related to what I've studied because we already have protections for things like privacy and the right to be free from undue incursion onto our lives. And so digital authoritarianism kind of attacks all of this on multiple scales. Repression is similar. I would say it's like an element of digital authoritarianism, just the ability to control the narrative, silence people whose voices you don't want to be heard by the public. Facial recognition is just the system of the digital infrastructure that's used to track, surveil, and store data about people. And what's really important to know about facial recognition is it tracks, the shape of your eyes and your nose, and then it puts all that data together, and it tells you, okay, this might be like this kind of person. What's most important, though, it's not a human doing all that, connecting the dots. It's actually artificial intelligence, which is where the problems arise. As I said, it violates privacy and civil liberties of innocent individuals. It's like a Pandora's box of rights violations. Privacy, expression, assembly, they're all threatened by digital authoritarianism. And not only that, but the technology itself is unreliable. There was a NIST study, National Institute of Science Technology, that showed that the type of people it can accurately, it meaning facial recognition, can accurately identify is not equal across demographics. So we know that they're misidentifying people all the time, which have real world implications for just regular civilians. Some constraints I want to talk about. We're only looking at 3 cases today. There are certainly more, but this is just for the scope of this presentation. I'm only looking at 3. And then resource considerations. Who am I? I don't have any insight into the government of Israel, the government of China, or the US, who are facilitating, as I'll show later, digital authoritarianism through surveillance. So this is purely just from a human rights standpoint. I studied international human rights law. I have an appreciation of the rights that were granted and accountability mechanisms too. So this is just kind of my input on that. And then there's an economic constraint too, because AI and surveillance technology is profitable. And so I think as much as we can talk about, oh, it would be nice to move beyond, or, like implement measures to protect our rights despite these technologies, convincing people to do that is a really big task. So the first case I want to talk about is CBP-1 surveillance at the US-Mexico border. Essentially, it's just a system of cameras that monitors all the people approaching the US border. Now, this is problematic, the whole system, because the ability to get asylum protection services is based on whether or not the camera registered that you entered at one of the entry points. And so I've previously done research on racial bias in AI, and this is fine, not just by me, but by multiple other people, that AI doesn't identify people all the same. It depends on the color of your skin, on your age, on the clothes you're wearing, on your gait. There are so many things that it could misidentify. And so if somebody isn't registered by the cameras as they're approaching the US border, and then they approach the border and try to get an appointment for asylum protection services, I think. But the computer tells the agent that they didn't, they entered illegally, essentially. Like they didn't go through the entrance. They'll be denied outright an appointment, access to services, and the ability to apply for asylum. There are literally entire human rights organizations that exist and live at the border to support all of the people who are turned away because of this technology. That's how significant it is. The second case, which is, in my opinion, the biggest because it's the most built out, I would say, is the occupied Palestinian territories. Israel has a tight system of surveillance all throughout the OPT, meaning Gaza, the West Bank. But specifically in the West Bank, in the city of Hebron, it's called a smart city. And that's essentially where they try out all these new AI technologies. So the bottom right picture is a smart shooter. It's an AI-controlled machine gun that is pointed at a checkpoint. The checkpoint is the picture on the left, which all Palestinians have to go through, regardless of where they're going, to go to school, home, work. They probably pass through 18 or 19 checkpoints in a day. So think about that. They have no freedom of movement. They're being tracked by cameras. Oops, sorry. They have kind of no say. There's no consent to their information being stored. All of it is immediately uploaded into like a criminal database. And so, that's just ridiculous. And then in the top right corner, we have like more pictures of the cameras. The surveillance system in Palestine is just ridiculously built out. And by that, I mean there are multiple programs/projects with different uses, essentially, that are weaponizing AI against the people of Palestine. And so for that reason, Israel is certainly a digital authoritarian against Palestinians, not its own civilians, because there are not such surveillance cameras in Israel. The third case is China, and China similarly has a wide system of cameras all throughout the country. I recently listened to a podcast where somebody who reports and dissents about the like level of government control in China was speaking about what it's like to essentially live there. And so the way that they framed it was all the technology companies and China's government are essentially linked. They work like their politics and economics are intertwined. And so that means that the government has total access to like all of our spending habits, all of our clicks on the internet, and not only that, but all of our movement because of all the cameras that are dispersed throughout the streets. And so in exchange, Chinese citizens are essentially socialized into thinking that this is okay or like being okay with it because they get social services in exchange. And essentially, if they abide by social law, then there's a benefit for them. And so this is, I would say, digital authoritarianism too, because not everybody is treated equal when they're tracked. And so China will actually use this data to find journalists, find dissenters, activists, or even like regular lay people who are maybe making online choices that they don't agree with, visiting sites that they don't like, spreading information, and they will actively seek them out and, impose restrictions on them. I guess the through thread for why I made this presentation and why I'm talking about just 3 random surveillance states is because I and many other practitioners of international human rights law know that we already have legislation that can be applied to victims of digital authoritarianism that will essentially uphold their rights. The bottom screenshot here, Article 17, is no one shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his privacy. Okay, I switched that. So this is from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So essentially it applies to everybody in the world. It's an international covenant of human rights established by the UN. And it says that nobody should be subjected to unlawful interference with his privacy. Now, in all of these instances, surveillance states, cameras recording our information, uploading it to a database accessible by the government is a direct violation of that, especially because it's without their consent. And so I would argue that we already have legislation to protect things like privacy and assembly and expression, all things that are being challenged by digital authoritarians because they essentially use digital infrastructure to punish us. The top screenshot is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And so this is, I'll go back to this right here, the machine gun in the bottom right. So it was developed in the way that it's advertised to other countries and people who want to buy it is a riot control technique. So essentially it determines just based on a camera and, the AI data that it's been trained on, whether or not people are civilians or military personnel, and that it can actually fire like hundreds of rounds into a crowd just to disperse it at the will of the data behind it. Like there's no human standing there actually doing it. So I bring up this distinction between civilians and combatants because this is more specific, but there is no distinction in who is surveilled and whose data is kept and stored and shared and leaked, essentially. From a human rights perspective, I also just really need to emphasize like fairness and accountability, because those pillars of civil rights, human rights, all of the above, are often overlooked in technological development, especially when there's economic benefits, aka profit, to be made from such technology, from selling it, from purchasing it, from implementing it. And so all of this like ties back to responsible AI, because I mean, all this technology is AI, essentially. Facial recognition is AI, putting together like data points on our faces. But how are we able to enforce like export controls on surveillance AI or develop international treaties against misuse if we're not all on the same page about what responsible AI actually is? And responsible AI also doesn't have to be the goal for everybody. In my opinion, responsible AI is technology that's willing to change, essentially. Willing to or able to by the developers. And so we know that this is not the case for all technology being developed right now. Not all developers, not the same values, not the same guiding principles. So when we talk about responsible AI, it's important to remember the context in which we're operating, because not everybody operates the same. I think that was all I had. Let's see. Well, I guess it would be helpful to talk about like moving forward. We've seen some like preliminary technology legislation, I guess you could say covenants, maybe not, like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, with explicit outlines for protections to privacy, expression, and association as it relates to the digital sphere. So I think it's really important to tune into these developments and how states, regions, countries are implementing them, because the language will need to be specific as it relates to surveillance technology, because I have a feeling that there are going to be a lot of loopholes that people can get through as it relates to social good. Oops. Let's say a government could make an argument that surveillance is needed to, as Australia is doing, contact trace for a global pandemic, or as the U.S. is doing, say that it'll be beneficial for us in the long run, because if somebody is trying to commit a domestic terrorist event, then we'll be able to find them essentially within our borders. But you have to also remember that not only are the worst targets being surveilled, it's everybody around them too, because we can't just isolate one person's data or one person's face. You have to get everybody around them, and then AI will do the distinction. Training communities and policymakers to make these distinctions, and to write this language, include it in their codes of conduct, in their due diligence assessments, is going to be super important moving forward. And yeah, I think we just have to remember that responsible AI requires vigilance, transparency, and collaboration. Any questions? And yeah, I think that's it.
Amina, this is a very controversial topic, and there's a lot of volatile elements and emotional elements that go alongside talking through these very concrete examples. But one thing is, nobody can argue that they do not exist. I mean, if you found them, they're concrete evidence that they are in existence. They were designed. Considerable resources were spent to bring them forth and create this oppressive effect. Because even if they shoot little marshmallows at you, the psychological, the in between the lines message is still understood loud and clear.
Right? Yeah, fully. And I think there's also there's identity implications for states that have been charged with using this technology. Because what do you mean? That could be your home country. That could be, like, states are generally portrayed in a positive light, but the reality is, of course, they're doing everything they can to kind of not let this kind of information bubble to the surface. And so I think I really appreciate and, will continue to support journalists and activists and human rights defenders who are just, the simplest act of talking about it is productive, I think. And the reality is this technology is also used to target civilians and journalists. And the same company that's developing like the cameras in the occupied Palestinian territories are developing like spyware that's imported onto your phone and that turns your phone into a camera and a microphone. So it's all intertwined. And as much as people maybe don't want to appreciate that it's here, I think we just have to, it's like radical acceptance.
Well, one thing that always comes to my mind when I engage in these conversations is, we have certain beliefs, and we feel it in our stomachs when we see something as concrete as those pictures and that narrative you told us. There are cameras that check your identity, that check your characteristics, and then there is a automated machine gun ready to greet you if it doesn't like what it sees.
Right.
But then, we say we have policy, we say we have rules of engagement in our domestic territory here in the US, and possibly in other countries that want to say that they're progressive and they champion the human spirit, the human rights. But we can't impose ourselves on every other country, or can we? What are your thoughts on that?
I wish we could. I think at this point, it's just taking a concrete stance and then being a leader in this would be the most productive way to move forward. Am I optimistic that the US is going to necessarily do that when this technology is being employed at our border? No. Do I think like another country who is maybe fed up with all of the rights violations that we're seeing with this technology, who don't use it themselves, to draft some sort of legislation or propose something in regional government, I think that would be more likely, because honestly, yeah, it goes back to the incentive that governments have for using it. And so if they're not willing to let up on their inhibition of speech or expression or association, then they're probably not going to be leaders in this realm of, taking appropriate steps to hold people accountable, to like really check the data that the machines are being trained on and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's such a complex topic because it also shows the bias in the data. You have a pharmacy, a big pharmacy here. The chain was fined extensively for implementing this automated surveillance system that assessed the risk of somebody being a thief in the premise, and they would constantly call people who had a darker skin. They would call the police on people who had darker skin tones, and that was blatantly biased and racist.
Yeah.
We're just gonna be very clear about how that was impacting people who otherwise were just regular shoppers. They just happen to have a different pigment, So
yeah, fully.
what can we constructively do about this? I know we're not satisfied with the conditions of where we are today, but outside of learning more, what do you think is some sort of resolution moving forward?
Honestly, I think just the ability to speak plainly and resolutely about objective things that are happening, and channel your inner activists, I would say, because civil society is super powerful. We have a lot of like bargaining power. It just needs to be directed at the right people or the right organizations, essentially. The NGOs that are releasing these, like 200 report statements that are being, submitted to governments that actually do have a chance of them being held accountable. Granted, I'm a human rights student, so that's like my life path. So not everybody is going to do that. But I think getting rid of the stigma of talking about digital authoritarians, not that I necessarily think there is one, but maybe it could be like a little hush hush, like, oh, we don't want to talk about this. We have family there, or, we have people who regularly visit, like, we don't want to offend anybody. But the existence of a surveillance infrastructure, it's not like it's hidden, you know? Like this technology is visible, and it has real world impacts. So I think if we could just speak plainly about it, that would be a great first step.
Are there any channels that you can recommend that people can use to anonymously whistle blow and invoke the presence of regulating bodies, like you said, NGOs, sort of
Yeah.
keep an eye on these things and have some legal backing to support and enforce human rights policies, international UN agreements, for example?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I don't know of any specifically. I know of like smaller institutions that are kind of working on this that I think would be more approachable, like labs at universities that are, tracking spyware being used on journalists. Like, let's say you know a journalist, or you read a story about one, or you have a family member, whoever it is. I think um, showing up for the people whose lives are like actively being impacted is a really great way too. And there are communities and affinity groups for people who actually want to organize with and assemble for people who are victims of digital authoritarians. So I think there's definitely just a lot one can do from their computer in terms of spreading information, making their friends aware, and then yeah.
Well, excellent. I mean, unless there's any other questions, I mean, you have a lot of positive feedback from Jessica. She says that's horrifying, when you showed some of those concrete examples.
Yeah.
And she's saying, thank you for bringing this to light. I myself am very interested in this area. We shouldn't be living in oppressive states in this day and age where we have hydroponic systems. We have ample opportunity to produce energy, manufacture healthcare, medicine.
Mhm.
We shouldn't be living in the dark when we have
Right.
a resource to live in abundance and happiness.
Yeah.
Uh, any last words that you'd like to impart before we?
Mm.
Doesn't have to be Socrates level.
Yeah.
But Jessica saying, when you say channel your inner activists, where can we get started with being
Oh,
proactive?
that's a great question. So it depends. It depends on like what kind of activism you're into. There are entire orgs dedicated to feminist advocacy, but there's also children's rights orgs. There's organizations for. Oops, I'm not going to look up. I think it might be good to start at like a big organization like Amnesty International. They're actually the ones who released like the 200, 300 page reports detailing surveillance, detailing apartheid. And it's the largest human rights organization in the world. So governments hear them and their presence is known. They have institutions on campuses, clubs. So definitely start there. They certainly have like an issues tab at the top, and then just hone in on like what you're most passionate about. And I'm from the Northeast US, so Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia. I kind of travel in between there, and there are a lot of people just in our communities who are also willing to meet about this, to talk about it, to organize for it. And I'm sure there's something going on in your community, and that would just be local organizing for different rights. And it doesn't even have to be like on a global scale, because of course we want to think globally but act locally. So I think just starting small and not feeling overwhelmed, because there are literally so many rights violations to be, um, you know, upset about and to want to change. But you just gotta start with one, and then I think the rest will come. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Amina, for this wonderful presentation. We're going to take a brief intermission, and then we'll be back in about 8 minutes. So we'll see you all soon in the next one.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.